All right, thank you so much everyone for being here. I am Mariah Casillas with Philanthropy Network Greater Philadelphia. And I want to welcome you to the event if you are part of our network or joining us from one of our partners at the Council of New Jersey Grantmakers. I feel like if we were in person, you should be applauding now, but you can also do it on Zoom. So Council of New Jersey Grantmakers, Grantmakers Council of Rhode Island, Grantmakers of Western Pennsylvania, and Maryland Philanthropy Network. I also, of course, want to thank Chicago Beyond for their partnership with us and putting on events over the years and for making sure we knew about their work as part of the abundance movement. We are very excited for the session and think it will be an important addition to the conversations that many of us have been engaged in about, how do we actually move beyond statements of solidarity, but to action in order to ensure long-term and equitable distribution to Black-led and centered organizations. So with that, I'll turn it over to the Abundance team to share more about the work and why we are all gathered here today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mariah. My name is, well, first, good morning, and to some it may be good afternoon. I'm calling from California, so I'm still on morning time over here. But my name is Jasmine Jones, and I'm just really excited to share more with you about the abundance movement. I am the first director, and 4 months into this work, and it's super exciting about we've already gotten started and what's to come. And so I'll turn it over to the other great leaders who will be joining us today and ask them to introduce themselves. Sharon, you can go first.
There's an abundance of leaders here, so I wanted to make sure you were talking about So hi, good afternoon. My name is Sharon Bush. I am the president of Grand Victoria Foundation. That's my day job. And what else, Jasmine? I'm sorry.
Just your name and your organization, your title. Who are you?
Be her pronoun. Thanks.
Thank you. Liz.
Hey everyone, so glad to be here with you all today. I'm Liz Dozier, and I'm the founder and the CEO of Chicago Beyond.
Thank you both so much. And if you haven't gotten a chance to already, please continue to add your name and your pronouns and where you're calling from and, really what brought you here today. And so I'll start off with a quick agenda review. And so today we're going to be sharing more about what the abundance movement is, really taking some time to reflect on the practices that stifle being in deep partnership with Black communities, and also talk about what does it mean to get to action. And so oftentimes we are in our theory space, in our head space, but it's hard to move to action. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like. And if time permits, we want to hear from you all. And so want to get a couple responses from the group, and we will go from there. And so Eva, if you want to move us to the next slide. Thank you so much. And so really quickly, wanting to kind of sit with this question of what does it mean to live in abundance and what does it mean to have an abundant mindset? And so in this sector, in the world, in the work, folks throw out a lot of language. We hear abundance, we hear trust-based, we hear equity, all these buzzwords, but really wanting to kind of center what does abundance mean to us? And so I'll take an opportunity to share really quickly, and then I want to invite Liz and Sharon to share what does it mean to live in abundance and have an abundant mindset. And as we're all sharing, I invite you to reflect on what that means in the chat and share what that means for you. And so we live in a world where, we're socialized to want more, more, more. We want the newest car, we want the latest purse, or, whatever it is, more furniture in our house. We always want more, and really abundance and living in abundance is a mindset shift. It requires us to really see the beauty in having enough and recognizing that, our cup is full, and when it's full, we can share and pour into someone else's cup. And that's what I think about when I think about abundance. It's not that we have to have a bunch of things. It's recognizing when we have enough and being able to connect with others to share that abundance. And so Liz and Sharon, can you tell a little bit about what the abundance mindset or living in abundance means to you?
Sure, I can get us started. I think for me, I think I'll start, it's a lot rooted in my long time in philanthropy. And so I've been in philanthropy for, 17 or 18 years total, something like that. And so much of my experience, particularly as a program officer, as a program staff person for many, many years, was having discussions that were rooted in a deficit, a literal deficit mindset about what happened with Black-led, Black-centered, Black place-based organizations as compared to other groups that we were funding. So really, I tell this story all the time when talking about this work. So much of that was a cognitive dissonance for me, like that is not my lived experience, that everything about being Black or in Black community has to be about the deficits. And an abundant mindset really is a shift in that frame to think about all of the contributions that we bring to communities, to the space, to the philanthropic space, and that we really shift away from thinking about what it means to invest in Black communities and thinking only about it as a problem-solving exercise.
Yeah, so I'll add to that. So I come to this work, Chicago Beyond now has been in existence for about 6 years, which it's so hard to believe. But I don't come traditionally from this philanthropic background. I spent most of my career, 20-something years, in public education, and I was a teacher and a principal. And the majority of that work was really in Black communities with Black children, Black families, Black nonprofits who supported the school. And what I saw during that time was just an abundance of organizations, Black-led, some not, but who were really in the mix of supporting our schools and our children. And what's interesting is when I switched to philanthropy, it was sort of the reverse of that in terms of like what was actually funded. Which was of shock to me. And so when I think about the mindset of abundance, there's a couple things that come to mind for me. So one is just the acknowledgement of the richness of Black-led efforts that exist in our community. Oftentimes, there can be perceived that there's one or two or three that are really investable, quote unquote, organizations that are Black-led. And so I think that's really important, just that the acknowledgement of that. And then I think the other piece for me is around just the structural shifts as we think about like how we actually do this work in philanthropy, how we move resources in this vein of, I would call it like just loving Black people, and how do we show up truly in love of our communities, with the idea that ultimately like we are better together. We are better when we are supporting one another.
Thank you both. And I'll just add a little bit to just extend there. I've worked both in the nonprofit and in the philanthropic sector. I was an organizer, and then I became a grant maker. And, I witnessed firsthand the imbalance in power. It was this kind of interesting thing when I went into the foundation. I immediately had all of this power. And I was like, whoa, wait a second, what is this, right? And oftentimes foundations, come into communities and they act like experts, trying to diagnose a problem versus coming in and really engaging with the communities in which they're trying to serve, and see them as the experts and really engage them in creating the communities and the changes that they want to make. And I think that's what the mindset shift is too, right? And when we think about abundance, it's recognizing that the folks who we are serving have all the answers, and how do we actually lean into them to create the solutions that we see in our communities. And so appreciate what you both have shared. And I'm going to move us into kind of like what the abundance movement is. Liz kind of got us started here. But really, abundance is an acknowledgement. It is really an acknowledgement of the rich existing Black-led efforts all over the country, and really finding the opportunity to support those efforts in a real way, in a deep way, to ensure that everyone can be free and everyone can have joy, and not just some special people over here and over there. It's a movement. We really want to move how we think about money and resources and the policies and practices to really shift the sector. It's a shift as well, right? And so we have to really get into how we do things differently. What does it mean to partner in a deep way? And how do we move in love and joy for Black people, opposed to feeling like they're problems to be solved? It also requires us to disrupt wealth. And so we cannot continue to do things business as normal. We've seen that, philanthropy has been around over 100 years, and the pressing issues that we all care about exist today, right? And so what does it really mean to disrupt wealth and redistribute in a way that we can visualize and actualize the communities we want to see? It also means that we can do better together. And so not one individual foundation or institution will be able to do this work alone, and that we are really better when we come together and do this work and act as a collective, and that there's great power in that collective action. Thank you, Eva. You're moving. And so what does it mean to commit to the abundance movement? And what are we asking for folks to do? Really coming into this movement and joining this movement will require foundations to set a stretch goal. We really want you to put out a target that stretches you to see how you can raise your annual payout to Black-led, Black-centered, and Black-serving organizations by 2025. And we really want you to start that action as soon as you join the action community, to begin thinking about what are the policies, what are the practices, what mindsets do I need to shift in this institution in order to really move and partner very deeply with Black communities. In order to do that work, though, you're going to have to examine your culture, your policies, and your practices that stifle that relationship and that partnership in order to shift that to get to that place of that payout that you want to increase for your community. It also, it's a call to action. It's a call to join a community who is doing this together. As I mentioned earlier, no one can do it alone. And so coming together to really grapple with how we do this, share stories, learn lessons, hear from others in the field who are making great progress to really be able to shift how your institutions are moving and doing the work. And ultimately, as a movement, in order for us to really see the communities and actualize the communities we want for Black folks, we have to build this movement. We have to bring everyone together and really shift the way philanthropy is thinking and doing and operating. And so you can move on. Thank you, Eva. And so now I want to just take a moment to ask you all to reflect on this question here. It really is a question about what unjust practices, policies, or outcomes you notice in philanthropy, specifically as it relates to Black folks. And I also want to kind of underscore whether it's intended or not, right? Oftentimes we get stuck in this, well, I didn't mean to do that. That wasn't what I was trying to do, but that's not what we're asking here. We want to just kind of ask, what are we seeing in philanthropy that's stifling folks for being in deep partnership with Black communities? And I'm going to open it up back to Liz and Sharon and kind of ask you all some of the things you've seen over your time in philanthropy that really perpetuate these outcomes we see. And then I want folks to reflect in the chat and share what are some of the things you've seen in your time in philanthropy that really kind of stifle this vision for our community.
Jasmine, do you want Sharon and I to jump in right now with some of our responses there, or wait till folks kind of put some stuff in the chat first?
Let's see, are folks putting stuff in the chat? If we want to give it a second, and if folks want to kind of add a couple things here, we can do that, but you also can take the lead and share some of the things that you all are seeing too.
Yeah, so as people populate the chat, I'll just talk through two things that jump out to me as I think about just some examples that Jasmine had mentioned. So one is just like the thinking about and unpacking the idea of power. When we think about our sector in particular, it's so interesting if you really kind of look at it from 10,000 feet away. We are, oftentimes the ones, and particularly historically, but even now in this current context, we are the ones that often are coming up with the ideas that are driving decisions or driving actually what happens inside of communities. And so, that power shift, I think, really requires us to examine, where do ideas actually come from? Who's generating those? And how are we supporting those ideas? And I think, there needs to be a pause. If the ideas and the things that we're supporting are always coming from us, i.e. those in research or, those in the philanthropic sector, I think it really causes us to pause. The other thing that I think is problematic is, and this is particularly, I think, with Black-led institutions, there is this, thing around risk. particularly when we talk about larger dollar amounts, particularly when we talk about, multi-year funding, or when we talk about flexible funding, that when, even for Chicago Beyond, we began to unpack, and this was like right prior to the pandemic, when we began to unpack how it was we were making decisions, who was actually getting funding, how much funding were they getting over time, we had to really assess, like, what was the bias that we were bringing to the table? What was the ideology that was informing, like, who got what, and how we perceived, again, like, risk of certain organizations. So I think about the two big ones for Chicago Beyond, and I think about for the sector as well, it really is that idea of risk and understanding, like, that, there is not necessarily, there's not more risk in funding Black-led organizations, but also unpacking, like, the power shifts that often come in the sector.
Yep, I think I'll tell a story that illustrates a lot of what I'm saying in the chat, and I think that builds on some of Liz's comments. We have a place-based grant-making program, and we have those grantees that we have in that program, we've been funding them for 20 years, a lot of the times without a lot of question. And there is one group there in particular that that has a Black executive director. She's been running the organization for many years. She's in the school system, deep in the school system. It's the second largest school system in the state. And, she's been killing the game for a lot of years. But our relationship with her under my predecessor was tenuous, really. And she has since shared a story about how painful it was. They always got a smaller grant. They were actually in and out of the grant portfolio for all of the reasons that you guys are putting in the chat. You're too small, you don't have a great revenue base. We can't really help you with that. Like, how are you gonna figure out what your plan is? This is a woman, and then my predecessor would say to her, but you're so creative, you're so wonderful, you're like the town square of this city, right? And when she came to us to ask us to help match the opportunity for a federal grant to, like, significantly expand the work within the school system, we said no. We said no. We gave her a really small grant to say, why don't you plan some more? She wasn't able to leverage that funding. And what ended up happening is that organization continued to this day, but in a smaller scale. Our relationship with this organization now is much different. We actually just made, I think, a $250,000 grant, which is probably what its budget is, or maybe even above. So, like, we have to have these conversations with them about tipping and all of the things, but we're willing to do that to support, like, what their growth is and to invest in this organization in a way that we think it deserves. Now, what they do is, this group is now the fiscal sponsor for a participatory grant-making program that we have there, which is actually designed for the people of color in the city to take the money, decide what to do with it, and to do some grassroots grant-making there in a way that we haven't done in the past, and for that to be led by people like her. So we're just trying to figure out how to flip the script, and because of all of the things that you say around risk aversion, perception of risk, unwillingness to invest appropriately, trying to just really disrupt that.
Thank you both for sharing some of the things you've seen in the sector, as well as giving some examples of how you already started to take some action around shifting those things. So I appreciate both, the problem and the solution. So thank you. Wanting to have you build upon that and share a little bit more about how we got here, right? And so the three foundations that came together long before I got here. And so if you could share a little bit more around what was happening in 2020 that really kind of brought this abundance movement to life, and also connecting what was happening in the broader world to, like, what was going on in your institution. Help us build upon why abundance movement came to life.
I can start that story off, and then Sharon, please, like, jump in, because this truly was the two of us on Zooms. We were definitely not in person, summer of 2020. But, we were all obviously, March of 2020, the pandemic happened. We started to see roughly around April, all the things that started to come out about health disparities, who was dying, who was didn't have access to care, all of those things. And then the murder of George Floyd happened. And with that murder, it was as if an aperture in the world had opened up. And we began to see, not just obviously Sharon and myself, but really the world began to see, all these statements of support from large corporations to city officials to politicians, like people really pledging to support Black people, to support Black lives. There was this, again, this aperture had opened where people had started to recognize the historical context of what had happened in this country overall with regard to Black people and racism and all of that. And, with all of that came a lot of pledges of support, a lot of statements of support. And Sharon and I started having some conversations right around, like I'd say, end of summer 2020 about that moment, and really talked about truly what this aperture was and how this was a really important time for, not just the statements, but what does this actually mean a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, like when this moment potentially passes, what will actually come of it in terms of action, what will actually change? And that's when we started pondering this question, what if, philanthropy as a whole celebrated Black abundance? What if it really celebrated Black communities, Black people? What if we really invested in, Black-led and Black-centered work? Like, what would actually need to happen in the space now to make sure that that seed doesn't just, die off a year, 2 years, 3 years from now, when ultimately, the pandemic will seed, when people will go back to life as usual. And so within our own institutions, at least from Chicago Beyond's perspective, we began unpacking a lot of our practices, particularly through our Rapid Response Fund. So as many philanthropic organizations did during that time, we began to work in tandem really with very hyper-local organizations. We did a whole thing around food for communities, and we really began to cement partnerships again with these hyper-local organizations. And from that, realized that if we were going to continue this vein of support, philanthropically, that it wasn't just, within our own institutions or within a few institutions, but that we really needed to essentially plant the seeds for this kind of radical shift in philanthropy overall, in terms of how philanthropy actually shows up in this work. And that's essentially where, the abundance idea came from and was seeded from.
And what I would add to that in a colorful way. Liz and I, we had a lot of conversations because we was mad, right? So, and that came from like two folks who had the same experience with these different kinds of perspectives. Hers newer in philanthropy, mine not as new. And we were expressing the same frustrations in 2020, which is like, we've seen this movie before in philanthropy, big old opportunity based on something horrible that's happened. If we don't all band together, whether it was COVID or the racial unrest, we're not gonna have an opportunity to change. But the thing that we saw, like with COVID, because these things are happening at the same time, it's like we could do what we want to do. We could do it fast, right? There was a lot of money that got poured into COVID really, really fast. And we were on the front lines of that, whether it was us at Grand Victoria Foundation, work that we were doing at the state level, work that Chicago Beyond was doing, where we were doing Chicago-based COVID relief funding. And why not have the opportunity to cement some of these practices in a different vein with something that was coming at us at the same time, which was just as furious, if not more. Like, people were on the streets without masks. They were not thinking about COVID when we think about what happened when Mr. Floyd was murdered. So, I mean, I think we were really determined to not let, as Liz said, like the opportunity to close, to like keep it wide open. The other thing for us in an opportunistic way, and I think he would say this if he were on the Zoom with us, which is John Palfrey at the MacArthur Foundation is a huge champion, and a lot of his rhetoric at the time was like deadly focused on the need to really support and invest in Black communities. So in our conversations, it's like, well, who are we going to get actually to like speak to white leaders, right? Like, how can we get this to be like a really inclusive partnership with someone, like, quite frankly, who can signal to others that it is okay to do this work, right? It is okay to not think about Black communities as risky. If we don't figure out a way to invest in them now, like we really will lose the opportunity. So we went to him, and he was generous with his time, generous with his ideas. And he's been a real partner, like on this road to like getting the abundance movement uplifted.
Thank you both for kind of sharing what was happening and what, you know, led to launching and leading this movement. You know, since I've been here, I've been in lots of conversations with foundations across the country. And in some of those conversations, you know, I get folks asking me, actually, Eva, sorry, you can turn the deck off and we can come together as a group again. But I get folks asking me like, well, isn't this sort of like a DEI training? Not quite. And so wanted to kind of build upon like why the abundance movement is necessary and how is it different. I also want to add that we recently had an action meeting where we're starting to come together and we're building this movement out and we're starting to take action. And I left that space feeling so much joy and happiness and like, oh my God, we're about to change things. It just felt so good, right? And so when I think about the abundance movement and what makes it different, it's not your average philanthropy kind of thing, right? This is about joy. It's about love. It's about happiness. And really want you all to share a little bit more about what makes the abundance movement different.
It is not DEI. I so appreciate you saying that. This is not that. And I think about DEI from a straight up individual perspective, right? So if you think about the layers, you think about like individual racism, structural system, like, right? Abundance is inherently about philanthropy's responsibility to look at itself, how we have developed policies and practices and mindsets that perpetuate the world that we see, for us to participate in that very differently as part of a system, as part of structural shift, right? Like we cannot continue to think about, we can only fund like the talented 10th of like Black organizations because they fit into this white dominant mode of like how it is that we assess, right? Like what looks successful or what is best, right? So there is a clear need, and I think grantee partners tell us this. We see this in all of these other ways of like thinking about decolonizing philanthropy or whatever these things are, they're all related. But it is time for philanthropy to be much more introspective about how we structure ourselves in order to see the world in which it is that we want to see, right? Like we can't make pledges and then figure out, oh, what are we going to fund in order to like, you know, figure out how to be part of this anti-racist, anti-Black, you know, world, or pro-Black, we should probably start saying, right? Without actually examining what we do, how we do it, why we do it, why do we have these results? If we are doing these things in this way, but we have the results that we don't want, how do we begin to like shift and change those things? It is a structural shift. It is a systemic change. It is not DEI.
Liz, can you add?
I don't have anything to add to that. That was perfect. I have nothing to add.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that because it's hard when you're in those conversations and they're like, well, isn't this DEI? Like, it's about action. It's about really changing how we do things. And yes, a component is that, you as an individual recognizing your mindset and what has to shift, but then how does that also influence your institution in the sector? And so thank you for your comments there. Liz, do you want to add anything about what does it mean to do this work in joy and love? What does that look like? How do you really lean into that?
Yeah, so that's actually the conversation that Sharon and I started with back in 2020. Like I mentioned, like we were on it was myself, it was Sharon, it was another colleague of mine, Shruti, on the phone, and we were trying to figure out, what exactly this was going to be. And I remember just sharing with the group, like, well, what if we really love Black people? Like, what would that really look like? And like, let's unpack that from the perspective of like our own relationships and people that we're in intimate relationships that we love, like family and friends, and how would we show up for those folks? And I think that we show up, typically in healthy relationships, right? We do show up with a sense of care, a sense of concern, but we also show up in joy and love, for possibility, for promise, for all those things that exist within those friendships and relationships. And really, this is no different. I think when it starts to go in that vein of the opposite, of joy and love, when it becomes this like drudgery or a dark thing that no one wants to pick up, that's when we know we're getting into dangerous territory, whether it's within our own institutions or whether it is in conversations that we're having, and when it becomes somehow this checklist. Because what we're talking about in abundance is not a checklist. It's not about, finding, a Black-led organization and funding that. It's not about, it is more than that. It is truly, a shift within our own practice, a recognition of the joy that is in this work.
Jasmine, let me add one more thing. The question that we would get, I'm sure you get this too, which is like, is it a zero-sum game? Like if we put more money into like this sort of thing that is about Black abundance, we can't like fund adequately into these other things, which is another way of thinking about a structural shift for philanthropy, which is like, if we're not able to do all of these things, maybe the way in which we're thinking about like, what is the whole pie, right, should be re-examined. So we're not asking like for people to make choices. We're asking about like, what do we need to do to abundantly fuel like the world that it is that we want to see, which has to include significant, deep, sustainable investment in Black joy, right? So I would say like, we're not asking people to make choices in the way of like creating, what is it that we say, like kind of like the
oppression Olympics.
Racial, yeah, that's right, the oppression, that's exactly right. So that is not this either, right? It is making a choice to say like, this is a key part and let's invest adequately in that, and like we have to figure out how to do that all around.
Thank you. Liz, you came off mute. Did you want to add anything?
No, I would just say that it goes back to Sharon's earlier point at the top of the conversation around asset versus deficit framing. And I think exactly what Sharon is describing is like showing up within this work, yes, in joy and in love, but also with an asset frame perspective.
Thank you. And so I'm gonna move us along to this kind of, how do we move from the pledges? How do we move from the theories and the kind of DEI trainings, if you will, to really taking action? And if you both can share maybe one or two examples of things that you started to think about in your organizations. You both mentioned some things earlier, but if you can share some concrete examples that folks can take away of like, what does this look like in real time in my foundation? How can I start thinking about what action looks like? That'd be really helpful. And then from there, we'll turn it over to the audience. We'll put a couple questions in there, the chat, and ask for folks to respond in the chat, but also we would love if we can get a couple of folks to hear their voices in response. So Liz or Sharon, tell us some of the things that you all are doing in your institution.
I can start. I mean, one of the things that philanthropy is really kind of notorious for is that I think we're getting better at it, but it's like, oh, the folks need to find us, their way to us, right? So if like these groups don't come and knock on our doors, they don't exist. And then when they do come and knock on our doors, if they don't have on a particular outfit, like we don't like that either, right? So one of the things that we're at Grand Victoria Foundation, we're really in the midst of a transformation to become a racial justice funder. A big part of that work will include a focus on Black communities. And one thing that we're doing right now is a bit of a study around the state. So we're mapping the social, economic, and civic power within Black population centers in the state. So this is like an ongoing research study. We're going to figure out like what that looks like around Illinois, and it will include like a database or an inventory of racial justice organizations, many of which we hope will be like Black-led, Black-centered, so that what we're able to do is be much more proactive in reaching out to those groups that are doing work in different places and in places that, you know, that we can have some assessment, like where it can like make a difference and have some impact. So like we're gonna do our homework. Like this is the thing that we talk a lot about in like racial justice training, racial equity training, that like we're gonna do that much better, very deliberately. And we hope the result like in the coming years will be like significant ways to invest much more deeply and at an increased level in Black communities across the state.
Yeah, so, you know, I mentioned a little bit earlier about how, you know, I came from this work as a teacher and a principal, and really just having worked in communities for decades. And, you know, I started Chicago Beyond. Like if you looked at kind of the list of things, you know, you would think perhaps, you know, we were doing our work equitably, right? Like, or we had we were doing pretty well. We had, you know, someone leading me who was, you know, proximate to community, who, you know, we had this team that I was building who had this diverse set of lived experience, folks who were doing everything from street outreach to former teachers. I mean, just, you know, really people who were embedded in the work. We had no preset process. But the truth is we were falling into, honestly, in the same traps that I think so many of us in philanthropy fall into, because that's just the way the system was built. And so for us, it really required this need to become conscious, like truly conscious of these traps, because that was the only way that we were going to actively work to like redesign what it is that we were doing. And so from that kind of active consciousness, if you will, came a couple of things. I think one, which is our rapid response fund. And this is our fund where we're getting out unrestricted dollars to, you know, community-based organizations, hyper-local community-based organizations across the Chicago area. And then the key part of that is not so much the fund itself, but it's actually how we source the idea. And so we created this People's Assembly. And it's a group of folks who are, you know, residents of Chicago, who are, some are nonprofit leaders, some are just, you know, all different, like, you know, doing all different types of things in the world, but they are truly closer to the work. And for us, it's about, you know, soliciting and getting from them, like the noticings of who's actually out there, who should we be funding. So actually thinking and unpacking that and how we're giving the funding, I think is another important piece there. So really rethinking our due diligence process, really thinking about how do we categorize impact. You know, impact is not just 10,000 young people served. That's actually, I would say, not it, right? But like really thinking about that impact overall. You know, we put out a report recently, well, actually it was recently. COVID will have you thinking like yesterday was like, not yesterday, but we put it out almost 3 years ago called Why Am I Always Being Researched, which really, you know, forced us to unpack like what was happening in the research context as it related to our communities and how are we participating in that. It's like building this like culture of learning in Chicago Beyond, and really unlearning was really big for us. And I think the last thing that was kind of top of mind for me is just like how were we being transparent as an organization about what it is we believe, what our philosophy was, and how we were actually holding ourselves accountable. I think philanthropy overall has this tendency to want to hold others accountable. So everybody gets held accountable except the institution itself giving the funds. But, you know, whole philanthropy, which is, you know, on our website, is really, you know, us putting out our philosophy, putting out what we believe, and really, you know, calling for the public and our partners and those nonprofit institutions to really hold us accountable to what it is that we say that we're doing and what it is that we believe.
Thank you so much, both for sharing your reflections and the things that you are doing in your institutions. I really appreciate, Liz, you mentioning the philanthropy piece and holding philanthropy accountable, and this kind of all the reports and things nonprofits have to submit and all the numbers and checking all the boxes to make sure they've done what they said they were going to do, but never this kind of like, we put out this statement of being in deep partnership with Black folks. Are we really doing that? And how are we doing it? So appreciate you just kind of lifting that up as an important thing. I am actually going to drop 2 questions in the chat right now. And I'm going to ask Mariah to help us identify a couple of folks in the audience who may want to respond to these 2. I went on mute. Sorry about that. This Zoom stuff. There we go. So the questions are in the chat. Want you to look at the questions really quickly. I'll read them out loud while you're looking at them. And if folks can raise their hand if you're interested in responding. The 2 questions that I have though are, how would foundations operate if we really love Black people? What does that look like? How would we change? What would shift in our institutions if that's how we were operating? And how can we hold ourselves accountable to Black-led and Black-centered organizations? And so going back to like, what does that look like? What could that look like? So would love if folks want to respond to that, if you raise your hand and identify and signal yourself, but also if Sharon or Liz wants to kind of really to the second question. I feel like we've talked a little bit about how we would operate, but what would it look like to hold ourselves accountable?
I just want to give a little bit of context to number 1, and then feel free, Sharon, if you want to talk about number 2. But when we think about that question, it's a powerful question. Like, how would we, as foundations, operate if we love Black people? And I think it's important to understand, what does the opposite of that look like, and what is happening in the field? And I think traditionally, I think it's slowly beginning to shift now. But typically, I think if we think about Black communities as Black people, we've been looking at our communities as, problems to be solved. And that is a fundamental that's just a completely different way, as opposed to really centering our ideology, centering our practices, centering our beliefs in this idea of love.
Thank you, Liz. Sharon, you want to add anything to that question, and or like, what is it? How do we hold ourselves accountable? What does that look like?
I think a lot of our responses, like throughout, have been responses to number 2. I mean, this is something I'm sure as a former organizer, and I have organizers on my team too, so does Liz. And one of the things that folks will talk about is that love and accountability are 2 sides of the same coin, right? So definitely, like, you feel a need to like shift and change, like when you are using like that kind of language. And for us to be like very explicit to say that what it is that we're wanting to do is to demonstrate that we love Black people, to say it first, because I think that in itself is a radical thing to do, right? Is to say we love Black people, and then we have to figure out, then how do we demonstrate that, right? Because the things that we've done so far have actually, as Liz was described, they're harmful, right? They keep us in a starvation cycle. They keep us in a hyper-competitive environment with each other, right? So it creates this Hunger Games kind of scenario. And I think for us, some of the things that are very tangible around like what that begins to look like, our staff looks different than it did 5 years ago. Our board looks different than it did 5 years ago. So the leadership of this organization looks very different, and it'll continue to do that. And in the coming years, we have an opportunity to continue to look at that in a very deliberate way. So it's not to say that we're going to transition to be like, oh, everybody who works at Grand Victoria Foundation will be a Black person. But like, we have this ability to shift like how we are structured and how we are governed in ways that bring on people who are very willing to show what it means to demonstrate what love looks like. We actually use that word on our team. And so we could be better and much more consistent at it because we're learning too, right? Like not all of us, just naturally know how to do this work because we're all conditioned to work a particular way. I think a lot of Liz's comments go to that. But those are just like very tangible things that like we can do, they're within our control to do. And when we just begin to shift language and these things internally, it's easier for these other structural things to follow, or it's easier.
I'll just add to that for number two. I think it's much about how we hold ourselves accountable as it is as how we allow others to hold us accountable, particularly the communities that we serve. I'll give a quick example of this. So Chicago Beyond is now 6 years old, and we started out, with our initial contracts or MOUs had very particular language that actually was not, I think, helpful in terms of creating partnership. It wasn't helpful in terms of for a variety of reasons. And, through relationships, through our partnerships, and truly being open to being held accountable, when partners would give us feedback on contracts or feedback on language, as difficult as that might be in terms of a battle or a thing with our attorneys, it's our responsibility to hear that feedback, to listen to that, to make the proper adjustments and to make that a reality. And so that's just a small example. But I think that, it is much about us kind of doing our own self-examination, holding ourselves accountable, as it really is about how are we listening to our partners, to community, and allowing them to hold us to accountable. And that goes back to that earlier point I made around power dynamics and power shifts. That is, not sometimes the easiest, but is, I think, one of the foundational elements as we think about the abundance mindset, the abundance movement, and abundance practices.
I say, Jasmine, I'm not seeing any, and thank you, Liz, very good enough. Any questions from the audience, but I think that really underscores the importance of these questions and how we all need to spend time grappling with them to come to some more answers.
Absolutely. And so, do we want to give it a second? Does anyone want to respond? I do truly believe, as Sharon mentioned earlier, we are all leaders in this room, and I truly believe you all may have something to share here. And we also don't want it to be just about us and we have all this knowledge and this information to give you all, but that rather we want to hear and learn from you too. And so please, if there's anything that you would like to respond to in relation to what would it mean, how would we operate if we really love Black folks, and what would it look like to hold ourselves accountable? I see Whitney has a hand up.
Hello. I think if organizations really loved Black people, we would, especially with working with nonprofits or other charities, we would really go out of our way to find other. I think it's something like that Cicely was saying, either certifications or expectations for people to reach to apply. I think we would have a wider net, or have even more things that we could show or use as qualifications. Maybe even things that we couldn't think of or that wouldn't occur to us, having been working in the nonprofit for years. I think if we could figure out a way to broaden that net, then I think that if we really loved Black people, we could find a way to widen that and welcome more people in and have more people apply for what we can give.
Thank you so much, Whitney, for being the brave soul. Thank you, Bert. I think you're on mute. Beth.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I'm in Philly, and we had this big conversation at our board meeting last year, and our board is, people who are working in the same field, which is around community-led arts education. And we actually got rid of our question that was what are the needs of your community? Because it's we know that, you don't have to write it all out again. And so we have a lot of questions about what are the strengths of your community, what compels you to work with them. And people still write all the as you would say, all the deficit statistics, like that's what they lead with. And we were talking about that we've sort of conditioned them that that's how you get money. And so even when we're not asking that, they're still thinking, because that's how they've been, you know, put through the grinder, that like, oh, if we act like, no, we have 1 million artists and we have all these things and our community is great, that somehow that's going to come out like you don't need the money. And so I think that just happens. I'd really love, you know, thoughts on that, because it's not even the questions we're asking anymore. It's just, how do you change the conditioning that is like, you know, for generations. So I'll go back on mute, but I'd be really interested to hear some thoughts on that.
Thank you, Beth. I think Liz wants to respond, and then we'll take the last comment from Mia. Liz.
Yeah, I just so appreciate you raising that. I think that is so true. And it is this trained response that organizations have gotten into because of the ecosystem of philanthropy and how we've set people up over decades and decades and decades to essentially tell, you know, the idea is like, whoever tells the best, worst story about our communities, you win the grand prize and you win the money. And so I think, you know, this is what the abundance movement is really about, is about, you know, philanthropic organizations, you know, linking arms and showing up in solidarity around things such as this, that these particular practices, ways of putting together application, ways of talking about this work, ways of funding this work, and really being in community in this. I've always been of the belief that, you know, a small group of people can really shift, they can change what happens in the world. And I think that this abundance movement is essentially the groundswell, if you will, along with other entities and institutions and folks who are really on the same vein to shifting for people for essentially showing up in those ways. But it starts, my point is, it really does start with us as the philanthropic institutions.
Thank you. I'm actually going to read a comment from the chat really quickly, and then we'll close with Mia. And so I think it's any, I might be saying it wrong, so forgive me. But it says, shift from trying to solve Black trauma, especially from a white savior lens, to supporting Black thriving and abundance funding community-led solutions. And so kind of really leaning into what does it mean to love Black folks and Black communities. It's really like, we don't have to solve the problems. Like, how do we really lean in and fund the problems that are, sorry, not the problems, the solutions that are already been lifted up for a long time. And so one thing I will say is a lot of the things Black folks have been doing, they've been doing it under-resourced for a long time and having deep impact. And so what kind of impact could we really have if we really gave big investments, right? And what would be possible for Black communities? And so I'll stop. I'll turn it over to Mia to close it out with this comment, and then we'll close.
I think the big thing that we as funders can do is ask less questions and trust more. We do that with white organizations on a regular basis. We trust for years giving funding to the same organizations, even though there's no improvement based on what their own metrics are, their funding has remained consistent. I think if we trusted that the Black organizations know what they're doing, they've been doing it for how many years on a shoestring budget, clearly they're doing something right. Give them the money. We don't need to ask more questions. We don't need to dive in deep to their mission and vision. Like, it's working, they're here, they're thriving. Let's just trust that they can get it done.
Thank you so much for that last comment, Mia. And so I am going to close us out. Just want to really appreciate, spending the time with you all today and sharing more about abundance in this session. We really hope, you have something that you can take home and think about. And we also hope that you consider joining the Action community in the new year. And so again, just want to appreciate everyone for being here today and hearing from us. I'll ask Liz and Sharon if there's anything you want to close us out. And if not, oh, is there anything you want to say to close us out?
I just want to share like an appreciation for this last strand of the conversation about how that behavior is like what gets rewarded. Like for so many years, white-led organizations don't do that. And I don't know, this was my conditioning. They would talk about, oh, we're so great, please fund us because we're so great. And I was like, well, what do you need us to fund you for? Right? Like, what else are you trying to think about to like, you know, have an, so like that is actually not the conditioning. And I would see that like in a very consistent way. And for us to reward that, the opposite, and not even do that adequately when we condition people to behave in the opposite way, and we still don't reward them in the way that like they should. I think that's a profound piece. Like we've had a lot of conversations, you, Liz, and I, with others around the country, but that's a kind of a new insight. So I really appreciate that, and the diversity of this group. So glad to be here.
Yeah, echo Sharon's comments, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. Jasmine, for putting this together for us, and just want to encourage folks, even if you're just a little bit curious, you know, like just really sign up for that one-on-one with Jasmine. I think that it begs us, particularly in this point of time, to begin to explore, to join the movement, to think about like how it is that we can do this work in better and more equitable ways. So.
Thank you so much both for sharing. As Liz and Sharon mentioned, there are links in the chat to sign up to chat with me a little bit more, to learn more about the abundance movement and how you can join the action community in the new year. Additionally, there is an invite for you to join our virtual celebration next week on Monday, where we'll be celebrating abundance and all the movement we've had thus far. And I also want to underscore, even if you're thinking a little bit of like, this sounds interesting, please grab some time with me, because what's coming up is that we can't do this alone. And it is going to take a community for us to really move this sector. And so consider deeply joining the community and doing this work with us. I'm actually going to turn it over to Mariah. She has a poll for us to take before we close out. Want to just make sure you know, you have all that you need and that took
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. This was incredible. So the poll, I just launched it, 3 very basic questions to see, you know, what you took away from this. But we will definitely, I think, be continuing this conversation and providing additional resources, including a follow-up email in the coming days. But we'll include all the links here, as well as more information about the abundance movement. So thank you, everyone.